All right. So wanting to work through an additional example for income and substitution effects. All right. So we're thinking about the choice between buying two different goods. All right. So I've got my X and my Y good here. Okay. Here's my original budget constraint, okay, or income constraint. And here would be kind of my original indifference curve. When I'm maximizing utility, the slope of that indifference curve will be the exact same as the slope of my budget constraint. Okay. So if I ever have, say, a price decrease in good X, okay, what that means is that buying the same amount of good X, because the amount that I'm buying is income over the price of good X, when the price of X goes down, I can actually afford to buy more of good X than I was before. But if I'm only buying good Y, the price of X doesn't influence that point at all. So the new budget constraint would be somewhere out here. Okay. So what is the case in this example is I can get to a higher indifference curve or a higher level of total utility once I'm maximizing my utility facing this new budget constraint. Okay. Um, so when I think about this price decrease, there's going to be two kind of impacts here, right? The first impact is even if I was able to afford the same amount of total utility, right? I'm facing new relative prices. So remember, the slope of our budget constraint is the price of good X over the price of good Y. So when the price of good X went down, our budget constraint became a little bit kind of flatter. So let's assume that when I was facing these new prices, try to draw these pretty parallel, right? That if I was able to afford the same amount of utility, but facing these new relative prices, that slope of that hypothetical, so we can kind of call this as like my hypothetical budget constraint, that movement would simply represent my substitution effect. So moving from point A to point B represented just my substitution effect, just a change in the relative prices. So it's always going to be the case when I'm thinking about my substitution effect is I'm going to buy whatever good is relatively cheaper. I'm going to go buy more of that. And whatever good is now relatively more expensive, I'll buy less of that, right? So that movement from point A to point B, that represents my substitution effect. Now, movement from point B to point C, that's going to represent my income effect, okay? So when I have these two goods, right, it looks like I bought, in this example, a little bit more of X and a lot more of Y. So I increased the amount of both of these goods that I was buying. So the income effect is going to be when I know that prices go down, I can think about my real income is income over price. So what happened when the price of X goes down, my real income actually goes up. So if the income effect for both of these goods is that when I had more real income, I bought more of them, both of these goods must be normal goods. Okay. Now, when I look here, what's the total effect, right? Well, if I wanted to say something about the total, I know that both of these effects are causing me to buy more of X. However, for Y, these are working in opposite directions. And so the change in Y, I don't actually know what that's going to be. In this case, the movement from the old to the new consumer optimum, it actually looks like what? I bought more of X, but a little bit less of good Y, which is telling me that that substitution effect must have been greater than the income effect if that total effect was in fact that I bought a little bit less of good Y. That must have been the impact that was kind of taking over or was the largest, right? So it's a little bit trickier. And here we can kind of draw out a graph, and I'll try to do so here in a second. But I want to walk through just kind of the shorthand. This is probably going to be all you would need to use to solve a question on the exam, okay? So let's say I have a similar setup, but just to get a different like flavor here, let's say the price of Y goes up, right? I can identify my substitution effect. So if I've got this X good and this Y good, it doesn't matter if they're normal or inferior, okay? So for the sake of this example, I'm going to call X a normal good and Y is going to be inferior. For the substitution effect, that doesn't matter. I'm just going to buy less of whatever is relatively more expensive and more of whatever is relatively cheaper now. Right? So when the price of Y goes up, Y is relatively more expensive, X is relatively cheaper. That's my substitution effect. Now, when prices go up, when I think about my real income, if prices go up, my real income actually falls. So for a normal good, this goes back to module 3, if I have less real income or I have lower income, I'm going to buy less of a normal good. But for an inferior good, when I have less income, we said we actually buy more of it, right? So in this example, that price change, what was the total effect? Well, notice in both of these goods, I can't actually say what's going to happen to the quantity of either because both of these effects happen simultaneously and they're pushing quantity in opposite directions. So what I would need to know is which of these was larger, okay? So if my substitution effect is less than the income effect, then what would happen to the quantity of good Y? Well, if the income effect is larger, then I know the amount of good Y I'm buying is actually going to go up. So here we kind of have this counterintuitive result, which is that if the price goes up, sometimes if the income effect is larger, I actually buy more of that good for the total effect, right? This was going to be our example of what we called kind of given goods, okay? So in terms of the exam, I would worry just about being able to identify income and substitution effects for both goods, depending on if they're normal or inferior. I won't ask questions about kind of the relative size of that substitution income effect. I know there was some stuff on the practice exam. We didn't have as much time to go in depth into that, and so that's not something I would necessarily expect you to know to be able to tell me if this was a given good, which effect is larger. I just want you to be able to identify the directional changes, right, for both the income and substitution effect. Okay. Now, what this could look like graphically. So we have the quantity of X and the quantity of good Y. What do I want here? I want an income effect. So I need a relatively steep indifference curve. So let's say we were originally kind of somewhere like this. Oops. So here is our kind of consumer optimum, right? If I had a price increase in Y, what is that going to look like? That means I can now buy less of good Y, but the same amount of good X. So here's my new budget constraint, okay? So what could happen is that new point, right, where my new budget constraint, the point where I'm maximizing utility, notice what has happened. That total effect, moving from point A to point B, I've actually bought the same amount of good X because that change can be indeterminate. However, I've bought less of good Y, right? Which in this case would tell me this isn't a given good, right? That when the price of Y went up, the total effect was that I actually bought less of that good. That must have meant that my for this inferior good that my income effect was actually less than the substitution effect. So this would be an example if I didn't have a given good. Okay. So we could end up with these kind of weird scenarios where that's not necessarily the case, where that the amount of why I buy doesn't go down at this new consumer optimum. It actually could go up if I had a given good, right? So instead of worrying about kind of drawing out your income substitution effects, I think the easiest way to solve these types of questions is using this shorthand, right? And I'm only going to ask you to identify income and substitution effects in terms of the directional change of those quantities because of them, okay? So I will kind of review a similar problem at the beginning of class on Tuesday. I'm trying to draw out one where we did have a given good. So we'll think about if I had something like this. And let's say this is my original indifference curve. If I saw a change in the price of good Y that resulted in me, right? So I had a price increase. If the new consumer optimum was actually up here, well, what did that actually do? I'm actually buying more of good Y than I was before. So that total effect was that the price increase actually led me to buying more of good Y, which must mean that Y is an inferior good and that income effect was actually larger, right? So if I ever saw this kind of counterintuitive result, I would know that this must be an inferior good. The income effect must have been greater than the substitution effect, so that total effect was kind of being driven primarily by the income effect, which was that when I saw a price increase, my real income would then fall, resulting in that for an inferior good, I buy much more of it. Okay. So here's kind of a depiction of a given good, a non-given good, but still inferior. And then here was kind of our kind of normal goods. But I would kind of, once again, for the sake of what we're doing on this exam, you don't have to draw these graphs out, identify total substitution income effects on the graphs. I'm just going to want you to be able to solve this kind of using this shorthand method. Okay. So once again, we'll review a similar question to this at the beginning of class on Tuesday. I'll pick two questions that are on the practice exam, change them a little bit to show you what would be more like what you would see on the actual exam, and work through that problem for all of you.